The Mighty Miss Malone, Chapter 9. The Gary Ironhead Dogs Meet the Chicky-Bar Giants. I was on the couch trying to read, sitting so I could keep my eye on the clock in the kitchen. So many good things were going to happen today. It was the first day of vacation, and our baseball team, the Gary Ironhead Dogs, was playing a team from Michigan for the first time in the Negro American League. The knock I'd been waiting for came from the screen door. She was right on time. Come in, Clarice. We hugged. Oh, Deza, have you been outside? It's a beautiful day for the game. I know. I can't wait. Jimmy says Pedro Two Toes' arm is okay and he might pitch. Then we really don't need to go home, do we? That's a guaranteed win. Clarice, I wouldn't miss this game for the world. Let's go. We hooked arms and started toward the library. We could read until quarter to noon, then leave for the park. The game was at 1, and we'd have to be early if we wanted good seats. Clarice said, So, is Jimmy going to the game too? Thinking about poor Clarice's crush on Jimmy made my skin twitch like a horse's when a fly lands on it. I love my brother, but ick! His face looks like he got run over by a train. She gasped, Oh no, that's not going to stop him from coming, is it? I rolled my eyes. No, Clarice. Jimmy said they asked him to sing before the game. She said, Oh, I hope he's okay. That poor dear. I thought the same thing about her. I know you're supposed to love and accept your friends and family the way they are, and not give them a whole bunch of suggestions to make them better, even if they need a ton of help. But this summer, I'd make Clarice see how crazy it is to look at Jimmy that way. Yuck. The wall at the entrance to the library had a huge new sign on it. God bless the pride of America, the brown bomber, Joe Louis. One of the librarians had painted a big picture of the boxer. He was in his underpants, saluting a American flag, with 100 white people waving and carrying signs around him. A pair of boxing gloves hung from a hook on one side of the painting. On the other side was a American flag. Underneath was a gold crown and "Our Champion of the World." Clarice said, Boxing gloves in the library? I said, I'm mortified too. Mrs. Ashton, the friendliest white librarian, pushed a cart by us. Good morning, Diza. Clarice, isn't it exciting? We said, Hello, Mrs. Ashton, how are you? She said, I'm about to explode. You two must be very proud. Clarice said, Ma'am? Oh, yes, you need to be very proud. Joe Louis is such a credit to your race. Clarice said, Any new good books, Mrs. Ashton? Stop on my desk. I have something for each of you. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Ashton said, Woo-hoo, go brown bomber. Once Mrs. Ashton pushed her cart into the next room, Clarice said, Oh, Deza, I'll die if she's got books about boxing for us. There was no escaping that doggone fight. Every single table in the library had a 1-foot-tall cardboard cutout of Joe Louis standing in the middle of it. At his feet were the words, We love you, Joe. A little pair of red boxing gloves was tied to each cutout. Ugh, let's go to the chairs in the stacks. Even there, a banner read, Give 'em heck, Joe. I said, Heck? In the library? Maybe it was because this was the 4th time I was reading Huckleberry Finn, but my eyes kept going up to the little cutout paper doll, Joe Louis. In every picture I'd seen, he'd looked like such an unhappy man. He must be wishing this fight was over as much as me and Clarice. He must be very nervous. I looked at the tiny boxing gloves. I whispered, Clarice? She was settled into her book. Clarice. She looked up. Huh? I whispered, Why do they call these things boxing gloves? Every glove I've ever seen has 5 fingers. The only thing that has just a thumb is a mitten. Clarice giggled very quietly into her hand, but a woman 2 tables away said, Shh. She sounded like a woman, or like a steam radiator starting up. I whispered, Boxing is such a stupid sport that they don't even give things the right name. Those things they call shorts look just like my brother's underwears. Clarice covered my lips with her hand, and I covered hers with mine, but our laughs squeezed out of the sides of our mouths. The shushing woman slammed her book shut, got up, and walked toward the front desk. I said, We better go. When we walked by the front desk, the woman pointed. That's them. Mrs. Ashton said, Oh, those two? They're just giddy with excitement about the fight. Outside, Clarice turned around and hollered back into the library, Go brown bomber! Someone inside hollered back, Whip the Nazi good. We love you, Joe. A bunch of whoops and hollers came from the library. Even Mrs. Ashton yelled again. We ran all the way to the park, laughing so hard that our heart almost exploded. We were at the park almost 2 hours early, and half of the bleacher seats were already taken. People were even starting to line up along the outfield fences. It was like a carnival. Clarice said, "My goodness, Deza, everyone looks so nice. We should have worn our church dresses." We climbed into the bleachers and found seats in the very top row, nice and high. I went back down to where people were getting scorecards. Some of the time, they're free, and some of the time, they charge for them. I asked a man who was walking away from the line, "Excuse me, sir, are the scorecards free?" "No, sweetheart, it's a penny for a card and a pencil." I said thank you and started back to Clarice. He said, "Wait a minute, aren't you Roscoe's daughter?" "Yes, sir." "I didn't recognize you at first 'cause you ain't got a book under your arm." I knew the man. Father used to play horseshoes with him. I smiled. "I'm sorry I didn't recognize you, Mr. Dukes. Here, I've got a spare card you can have, and a pencil too." "Thank you, Mr. Dukes." He got back in the line. The scorecard said that the other team was from Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city geologically located 100 miles northeast from Gary. As I climbed back to the top of the bleachers, both teams came out on the field. I handed Clarice the card. "Pedro Two Toes Torres is pitching. Grand Rapids has some southpaw named Lewis." Clarice said, "Mr. Two Toes' arm is really better?" The man next to us said, "According to him it is, but you can't believe a word he says." A woman in front of us said, "That's the truth. I grew up with him back in Mississippi, back when he was Peter Thompson, before he discovered he was a Cuban and changed his name." People all around us laughed. The players from Grand Rapids and Gary were leaning against the fence along the first baseline, looking out into the crowd. People in the bleachers started standing up and looking back. Clarice shouted, "It's Jimmy!" She leaned into me. "Oh, Deza, he's so good looking." I nearly choked. Jimmy was standing on a picnic table in the center of a growing circle of people. Clarice said to the man next to us, "Sir, could you watch our books and save our seats for us?" "I sure will." She pulled me down the bleachers as we headed to where Jimmy stood above the crowd. His eyes were closed. There were so many people standing around the table we couldn't get very close. Clarice hopped up and down, waving and yelling, "Jimmy, yoo-hoo, over here!" I knew Jimmy couldn't hear her. He was settling into his song. He cleared his throat, took 3 deep breaths, held the last one, then sang, "Oh, say can you see?" I'm not sure what's more surprising about the first notes of any song Jimmy sings, what it does to me or the changes it brings in Jimmy. I have to close my eyes just like he does. I can't tolerate anything that would interfere with hearing his voice. Listening to Jimmy brings to mind how Father used to sing around me and around my wrist until everything became swing me around and around my wrists until everything became a blur. And even though I knew he was holding me, I felt like if I didn't hang on as tight as I could, I'd fly off into the sky like an arrow. And it seems like Jimmy makes himself larger and larger as he sings. If I opened my eyes, I'd see he'd grown so much that he was filling every square inch of the park. No room would be able to hold him. Chairs and rugs would get crowded up against the walls. His voice always stayed light and high-pitched and soft, but it was strong in a way that let on that there were stories behind each word. By the dawn's early light. It felt like those words were asking you something and telling you something and blaming you for something all at the same time. What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming. He finished the anthem, and the home of the brave. There was no sound from the baseball diamond or the bleachers or the people bunched around the picnic tables. Then an explosion of cheers and a huge throwing up of hands. Clarice was back to hopping. "Yoo-hoo, Jimmy, it's us over here." But so were a bunch of other bad taste girls. He couldn't hear her. People started yelling, "Sing us one about how Joe's going to clean that Nazi's clock, little Jimmy." "Yeah, little Jimmy, sing something about Joe." Jimmy laughed, raised his arms, and started singing. Everyone but me and Clarice knew the song and sang the chorus. "Oh no, Joe, don't you kill that boy. Bust his head, then send him back. Oh no, Joe, don't you kill that boy. Hit him hard as the grill on my pa's Cadillac." They sang that 2 more times before Jimmy stepped off the table and disappeared in a forest of adults patting his back and shaking his hand. On the way back to the bleachers, everyone was buzzing about Jimmy. I was proud and embarrassed all at the same time at the way Clarice was blurting out, "She's his sister, for real!" We got back to the top of the bleachers just as the umpire shouted, "Play ball!" The man we were sitting next to had been right. You couldn't believe a word, and that Two Toes Peter Thompson said. His arm was shot. The first two batters he faced sent the ball sailing out of the park, and me and Clarice and the rest of the crowd booed Mr. Two Toes with all our might. The woman in front of us said, "Don't worry, he settles down after a while." By the time he did, the Clicky-Bar Giants had scored 4 runs, and their lefty pitcher hadn't allowed one. 4-0. We'd been shut out. As we walked down the bleachers, men were handing out flyers and saying, "Small cover, food will be served. Bring the family, brand new RCA Victor." Clarice took one of the flyers and then said, "Yuck, the fight." A million places around Gary were having fight parties where you could listen to the fight on the radio. Some were charging money. Father's friend, Mr. Bobbin the barber, had invited us to his shop to listen. We didn't have to pay, just bring a dish. Jimmy had already picked a ton of wild greens, and Mother had got a perfectly good piece of meat that the Carsdales were throwing out to season those greens extra special. Clarice was going to come with us. I have to admit, I was a little excited about getting together with a bunch of people and talking and sharing food. We got to my house, and we held up 2 fingers, pointed at our cheeks, and held up 1 finger and put our hands on our hearts. I opened the screen door. Mother called from the kitchen. "Deza?" "Yes, Mother." Oh, Mother, it was a disaster. The Iron Head dogs were shut out." That evening, during Chow Chat, Father said, "And you, my dar Dwat, how was your day? Anything new?" Where to begin? Jimmy singing in the park? No, that was his story. The Ironhead dogs getting shut out? No, I bet Father already knew that. Besides, he hadn't found work, so that was bad enough news for the night. I remembered what I wanted to ask. What does it mean when someone says you're a credit to your race? Mother and Father shot each other a glance. Jimmy said it means some white person's grateful that you left them in peace, that you didn't stab 'em or shoot 'em or rob 'em. Mother said, "Jimmy, please, give us the context, Deza." I told about Mrs. Ashton and Joe Louis at the library. Father said it has to do with intentions. Usually when people say that, they have good intentions. They think they're giving you a compliment, but when you look at it, Jimmy said, it's an insult. "I can't deny that, Jimmy," Mother said, "but you learn you have to make allowances. You have to know which battles are worth fighting." Father said, "And credit to your race," and a lot of other sayings you'll be running into are things that give you a warning about whoever it is who's saying them. I said, "How's that, Father?" "Think about a strange dog, Deza. They let you know if they're friendly or not, right?" "Yes. Unless they're rabid, they give you signals that if you get any closer, you'll end up hurt. Their ears will go back, their fur will stand up, and they'll show their teeth." Jimmy said, "They'll growl." Right. Think of credit to your race as that first growl. Just be aware that the person is letting you know you need to keep an even sharper than normal eye on them. But be grateful too, because they're letting you know exactly who you are. Mother said, "What did you say when Mrs. Ashton told you?" Clarice changed the subject. Mother said, "That girl has such a good head on her shoulders." I don't like to be unhumble, but anyone could see I have great taste in picking my friends.